Okay, so now we'd like to open the floor to questions, and I'm going to take one of these microphones so that we can pass it on between speakers. If you have a question, please go to the microphone because this is being videotaped and we'd like to capture your question. So, any questions?
Are there any studies that directly correlate sodium intake with vascular volume?
I did a bit, but I can say when we did the WHO, when we looked at the cup, that wasn't one of the endpoints that we specifically looked at was vascular volume. I mean, you do see some vascular dilution, which is part of the elevated blood pressure as a mechanism for getting there, but we didn't actually specifically look at the mechanistic approach.
But if it's strictly, possibly it could be strictly vascular volume, and a lot of what I've heard today would be irrelevant. If they can't control their vascular volume, is it a sodium problem or is it something else?
Yeah. Sure. I mean, sodium is one of the things that does, interfere with vascular volume. You're right. That's why one of the main treatment modalities is diuretics.
I think, let me just say a little bit about that. You're absolutely right that there's just so much that's involved in vascular volume, and sodium is part of it, but not the whole thing. There was a study by Alderman in 2012, and he looked at a number of studies about no consistent positive relationship between 3 to 5 grams of sodium intake and cardiovascular events. So.
Thank you very much for your presentation. It was very well done. I just have a question about, do you have any evidence of the effect of exercise on sodium sodium regulation, for instance? For instance, we know from since Dr. Booth that we should normally look at normal people when they are active because they are representative of what we were and not what we are now. So is there any study done on the effect of exercise on the sodium intake and regulation?
Sodium intake in terms of exercise, I mean, in strenuous physical activity, but I did a review, one of the IOM reports many years ago on the electrolytes in the military. I was one of the reviewers. I wasn't a part of the panel member, but they actually were wondering about, do they need to have sodium supplements, for example, like salt pills for the, the military in high, and these are extreme conditions. And out of that report was the recommendation that they actually don't really require the extra salt pills, that the best and most effective way was to allow them the time to adapt to that strenuous physical activity. Their physiological processes would then kick in and they wouldn't need the supplements, and actually in a way you'd be almost doing more harm giving them those salt pills because then you don't allow the normal physiological adaptation to the strenuous exercise and the strenuous, high arid, dry conditions.
I can make a comment about that, and with people who exercise, for example, ultramarathoners who maybe drink a lot of water, and so you could get water overload, and having some extra sodium to balance that might be helpful.
Yes, sorry, thank you both for very good presentations. I actually have, two questions. My first question is regarding this normal range and the physiological range. I agree maybe, or not agree, but I could see the point when looking at different populations. It's difficult to say maybe, even if that's the normal range, maybe it's still high, but we can't argue with physiology too much. So in terms of numbers, I believe, please correct me if I'm wrong, I think the renin-angiotensin system kicks in at slightly less than 3,400 milligrams of sodium. Is that correct assumption? And what do you have to say about that? And I'm opening that to both of you.
I'll start, but I think we both could look at the same graph and say whether, where do you have elevated levels. If you look at that noise along there, whether the asymptote goes up at as my colleague suggested, at 150 millimoles a day, or I say that's equally that there's no significant difference until you're well below the 50. And I don't have that slide with me, but there's a lot of noise in that range. And I mean, you can see that it definitely goes up when you're in that very extreme low levels, but in that mid-range, I would question whether that's a biologically relevant, statistically significant difference, or it's just a difference amongst.
So what is the
around
number
mean.
you're saying? That, the
Well, I
range?
mean, I'll let my colleague answer it. She had that slide up, and I didn't have it, but there's a lot of variability until you get in the very, very low ends, and that's well below the, like that's down well below the 1,500
Okay.
milligrams, like the 50 micromolar,
Okay.
Nanomolar range.
Okay.
Pretty low, but well below the 100, okay. Yeah, and the 100 is the 2,000, 2,300 milligram, but it's well below that level. Whether we start arguing whether it's 50 or 80, or we may be like the people doing vitamin D, then eventually we'll decide which is the, but it's clearly it kicks into gear at the very low levels.
That it clearly kicks, but then it might be kicking at slightly higher, but it's not. There's a lot of variability, is what you're seeing there.
Yeah, I think that's really the point, that there is a variability. We need to look at individuals and see what happens instead of just looking at broad population goals.
Okay. And sorry, and just quickly, my second question was, you talked about feasibility. Has there been any studies to show that it's feasible to consume diets that are less than, let's say, 2,000 milligrams per day in terms of not having unintended consequences on other nutrients and nutrient adequacy, et cetera, et cetera?
Well, again, I just think that's such an important question, because we need to tie sodium usually to calorie intake. And people who eat more calories have more sodium. If you're cutting back the sodium, there sort of two things can happen. You might end up consuming fewer calories, and if you need those, that would be an issue. But we've also found that people cut back on sodium, and then they have this physiologic need for sodium, and will continue to eat until they get the sodium, and that way they get excess calories.
Okay, thank you.
I'll make an answer to that. I think one thing is the sodium relationship to calories. I mean, it's fairly tight. We looked at it in Canada, but it's not totally a one-to-one relationship. But I think that's saying that's making the assumption that you've got the same food supply. Because I think with our current food supply, it would be very hard to have a lower sodium choosing the foods we have available on the marketplace unless those foods are reformulated, or you had a totally, sort of, you make all your food from scratch at home type diet. And I think the other thing too is also have to recognize that the question was about whether people compensate eating. There is evidence out there. There is some compensation, but it's not 100%. The people who have actually fed people lower sodium do acclimatize to a lower sodium diet. There sometimes is a slight increase, but they don't revert to where they were by adding extra salt to where they were prior to going onto a lower sodium diet.
Thank you.
Yeah, they had the trials where they lowered sodium, and then they gave people either a placebo or a sodium substitute pill. And the people who got the sodium, they didn't know which one they had. They all reverted to about where they'd been before. So the people who got the huge amount extra in a pill didn't consume more than they had before. And the people who got the placebo looked for the sodium in the food that they got. That's just one study that I've seen, but it seems to make sense to me. And if it doesn't make sense, then we need to do some more research to figure it out. And so one of the main ideas that I have about this is that we're uncertain, and so let's not make any goals or any recommendations if we do have the uncertainty.
What hasn't been addressed is the fact that sodium retention is dependent upon insulin levels. And there's an intimate interaction between carbohydrate intake and soluble carbohydrate intake and sodium retention. It's not really the amount of sodium you take, it's the total retention in the body and the extracellular fluid volume that determines the blood pressure. And so the question of that you can take any amount of sodium you like, but if your insulin levels remain low, then usually people will excrete it. If your insulin remains high, even with a low intake of sodium, there is marked retention. and people develop edema with that. So the relationship between carbohydrate intake and sodium intake has not been really considered in this equation, and I would like to address that.
Well, you know, again, a whole nother idea about where we could look at this, and so there's uncertainty. I think that people who have normal glucose handling might not have those same issues as somebody who would have some abnormal glucose or abnormal insulin issues.
I don't really have a question. I have some comments. Thanks, Mary, for that excellent review of the evidence. I think it's absolutely clear that we have to decrease our sodium intake, but I liked Alexandra's approach to how we need to do that, although she didn't necessarily support a reduction. And I do truly believe that we need to focus less on sodium and more on our food supply and our education. So I think there's two approaches. One's our food supply and decreasing the sodium content of our food. But in our education approach, I think we really need to focus on your approach, Alexandra, and that's focusing on food, eating together as families, eating fewer processed foods, and that needs to be our approach rather than focusing in on the nutrients like sodium. If
Okay,
you
but-
have comments on that, I'd love to hear them.
Didn't we talk about all the gourmet salts that we have now? Could they be part of our diet? The pink Hawaiian Himalayan salt?
I'm sorry, if you're asking me to comment, I didn't hear your
Yeah.
question.
Did we discuss gourmet salt, something like pink Himalayan salt? You know, so people eat whole foods, and then they're still going to search for salt as a additive.
I'm not sure that there's evidence to support that.
I don't know if there's evidence, but I mean, people do it because it's part of a whole foods diet.
Yeah, no, Janice, I mean, I totally agree with you. I mean, I wouldn't have spent my life in nutrition without recognizing there's a healthy pattern of eating, which, you know, the evidence says, you know, increasing fruit and vegetables. But the reality is people eat a lot of processed foods, however they put the diet together. I would love to say that they didn't. But if that's the choice they're making, I think that the only way to get your lowered sodium intake, if that's the type of foods they're choosing to consume, is to have the food supply you know, become lower in sodium.
Okay, did you each want to make a last statement, or you said it all? Anything you want to add? Okay.
I'm just going to say it again. We're uncertain, and we need to find out more before we make broad recommendations.
I'll say my last bit then. I would say we are uncertain at the very low levels of sodium, but I'd say we're absolutely at good levels of evidence to get our sodium levels down below 3,500 milligrams and get them closer to, even if it's to the UL, which is where we focused and made our recommendations for the sodium working group. If we could get there, we'd be a long way towards reducing our hypertension rates in this country. And then if we do that, well, then we can, by that time, maybe we'll understand what's going on at the lower levels better in the next 5 or 10 years.
Okay, well, thank you very much for 2 excellent presentations, and now we're all clear on what this should be. So if you could, thank you.